He said it so casually over the phone, "Mom, it's just for family this time." The words sliced deeper than I expected, cutting through decades of love, sacrifice, and devotion with the surgical precision of indifference. Just for family. As if I were some distant acquaintance who'd overstayed her welcome at their dinner table of life. Before I tell you how those words changed everything, how they stripped away the carefully constructed illusion I'd been living in for years, please like, subscribe, and tell me where you're watching from. Because this story goes far beyond any cruise ship sailing into the sunset. This is about the moment a mother realizes she's been relegated to the role of a supporting character in her own family's story. The rage didn't come immediately. First came the confusion, then the hollow ache of disbelief. But the anger? That would build like a storm, gathering strength with every memory of what I'd given, what I'd sacrificed, what I'd endured to be dismissed with 6 words over a phone call. I stood at that terminal like a fool, clutching my suitcase handle so tight my knuckles went white. I'd been there for an hour, watching families reunite, watching lovers embrace, watching the world move forward while I remained frozen in place, waiting for a son who would never come. The phone buzzed against my palm, and for a moment, my heart lifted. Maybe they were running late. Maybe there was traffic. Maybe Daniel had forgotten to tell me about a gate change. But when I read those words, "Sorry, Mom, Sarah thinks it should just be us 4. You understand, the ground beneath my feet might as well have opened up and swallowed me whole. Us 4. Sarah, Daniel, and the grandchildren I'd helped raise, who called me Nana and begged for bedtime stories just weeks ago. Us 4. A complete family unit that apparently had no room for the woman who'd given birth to half of it. From across the departure area, I saw them. Daniel's familiar laugh carrying over the crowd noise, Sarah adjusting little Emma's backpack, 10-year-old Jake bouncing with excitement. They looked so perfect, so complete, so utterly unburdened by my absence. Daniel waved to someone, probably Sarah's sister, who always made it to the family events, who always seemed to merit inclusion in ways I no longer did. I didn't cry there in public. I couldn't. 68 years of conditioning had taught me that emotions were private things, messy inconveniences that made other people uncomfortable. Instead, I whispered those 2 words I was for. Like a prayer or a curse, I couldn't tell which. Then I turned around and walked away, dragging my suitcase behind me like the remnants of my dignity. The house felt different when I returned. The same furniture, the same family photos lining the mantelpiece, the same comfortable clutter of a life lived, but everything looked foreign, like I was seeing it through someone else's eyes. The Christmas decorations I'd left up because Daniel always loved how festive they made the house feel now seemed pathetic, desperate. Holiday cheer for an audience of 1. I touched the framed photo of Robert, my late husband, his kind eyes staring back at me from behind glass that needed cleaning. "You'd be ashamed if you saw this," I whispered to his memory. "You'd be ashamed of what our son has become, of what I let him become." Robert had always seen through people's pretenses, had always called out cruelty masquerading as kindness. He would have seen this coming long before I did. The pain in my chest was physical now, a crushing weight that made breathing feel like work. 23 years since Robert died, and I'd spent every one of those years pouring my love into Daniel and his family, convinced that if I just gave enough, loved enough, sacrificed enough, I'd earn my place at their table permanently. What a fool I'd been. I found myself in the kitchen, opening drawers with no real purpose, until my fingers found the manila folder tucked behind the recipe cards. The property file, documents I hadn't looked at in 5 years because I'd never needed to. The house Daniel and Sarah lived in, the one they'd raised their children in, the one they considered their sanctuary, it was mine. Every legal document, every deed transfer, every property tax bill bore my name. I'd bought it for them when they got married, young and broke and full of dreams they couldn't afford. "Just until you get on your feet," I'd said, expecting maybe a year or 2 of help. That was 12 years ago. They'd never once mentioned paying me back, never suggested transferring the deed, never acknowledged that their entire adult life was built on my foundation. The irony was exquisite and awful. They'd just excluded me from their family vacation, treated me like an outsider to their happiness, while living in a house I owned, sleeping in beds I'd helped furnish, raising children in rooms I'd painted. The betrayal cut so deep I could taste copper in my mouth. This wasn't just about a cruise anymore. This was about years of being taken for granted, of being treated like a convenience rather than a person, of watching my own son learn to see me as optional. And, suddenly, standing in my kitchen holding proof of my own financial generosity, I realized something that should have been obvious years ago. If they could exclude me from their lives so easily, maybe it was time I stopped financing those lives. I called my attorney first thing Monday morning. Richard Hartwell had handled Robert's estate, had walked me through the legal maze of widowhood with patience and kindness. His voice was warm when he answered, probably expecting some routine question about taxes or investments. "Richard, I need to understand something about property law," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "If I own a house that someone else is living in, what exactly are my rights?" There was a pause, then the careful tone lawyers use when they sense drama brewing. "Margaret, is everything all right? I just need to know what I can and cannot do with property that's legally mine." He explained it all with clinical precision. The house was mine fully, legally, unquestionably mine. I could sell it, renovate it, or reclaim it with proper notice. The fact that family lived there didn't change the fundamental legal reality. They were essentially tenants in a house I owned, with no rental agreement and no legal claim to residency. "Are you thinking of selling?" Richard asked, and I could hear the concern in his voice. "I'm thinking of a lot of things," I replied. "They cut me out of their lives, Richard. Maybe it's time I stop financing those lives." After I hung up, I sat in Robert's old chair and felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Clarity. Not anger, that would come later, but a crystal clear understanding of my situation. I'd been operating under the assumption that my love for them obligated me to endless generosity, but love was supposed to be reciprocal, wasn't it? I pulled out a journal I hadn't touched since Robert died and wrote my first entry in over 2 decades. Today, I woke up from love's blindness. Today, I remembered that I'm not just someone's mother, I'm someone. Elizabeth Morrison had been selling houses in this town for 30 years. She'd sold Robert and me our first home, had helped us upgrade twice as our finances improved. When I called her Tuesday morning, her delight at hearing from me was genuine. "Margaret, what a lovely surprise. How are you holding up, dear?" "I'm well, Elizabeth. I need your professional opinion on something. How quickly could you sell a 4-bedroom colonial on Maple Street?" "Oh, are you thinking of downsizing? That house has gotten awfully big for just you." "It's not my house, Elizabeth. It's my son's house. But I own it, and I'd like to sell it while they're away on vacation." The silence stretched long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. When Elizabeth spoke again, her voice carried the careful neutrality of someone who'd seen enough family drama to fill several Lifetime movie channels. "When do they return?" "Next Wednesday." "Margaret, honey, that's not very much time for a transaction." "I'm not looking for top dollar, Elizabeth. I'm looking for closure." She understood immediately, the way women of our generation often do. She'd probably seen her own share of ungrateful children, had probably bitten her tongue through her own family disappointments. "I'll make some calls. There are investors who can close quickly if the price is right." Thursday afternoon, I met Elizabeth at Daniel's house, my house, for the showing. I'd used my key, the one they'd never asked me to return because they'd never imagined I'd use it without permission. Walking through those rooms was like touring a museum of my own discarded importance. The living room where I'd hosted Christmas morning for 12 years, watching the grandchildren tear through presents I'd carefully selected and wrapped. The kitchen where I'd cooked Sunday dinners, where I'd taught Emma to make cookies, where Jake had done homework at the counter while I prepared meals for his parents who were too busy to cook. Family photos lined the hallway, vacation pictures, school events, birthday parties. In not one of them was I visible. Not one. It was as if I'd been systematically edited out of their happiness, present for the work but absent from the joy. Elizabeth walked through with professional efficiency, noting updates that needed to be made, calculating square footage, assessing market value. But I could see her glancing at me occasionally, reading the story written in my posture, in the way I touched familiar objects like I was saying goodbye. "The buyer I have in mind can close by Tuesday," she said as we stood in the master bedroom, the room where I'd nursed Daniel through childhood fevers, where I'd helped Sarah pick paint colors, where they'd conceived the grandchildren who now barely knew my name. "Perfect," I said. "They said they needed space from me. I'm giving them all the space in the world." I wrote 17 drafts of that letter. 17 attempts to capture years of hurt, disappointment, and awakening in words that wouldn't be dismissed as the ramblings of a bitter old woman. Some drafts were pages long, cataloging every slight, every forgotten birthday call, every last-minute cancellation. Others were just a few lines of cold fury. But the final version, the one I left on their kitchen counter next to the signed deed transfer and a photo from their wedding day, was perfect in its simplicity. To Daniel and Sarah, "The house you lived in was never a gift. It was trust. You spent it. It's gone. The key to your new storage unit is with my lawyer. Don't call. Don't text. Take this time to build the family you chose without me. Margaret." I chose the wedding photo deliberately, not out of cruelty, but as a reminder. In that picture, Daniel was holding my hand as I walked him down the aisle, Robert having died just 2 years before. Sarah was radiant, grateful, calling me Mom, with tears in her eyes. We'd all believed in something that day, in the expansion of love rather than its rationing. The storage unit had been Elizabeth's suggestion, a touch of mercy. I probably didn't know them, but provided anyway. Their belongings, a lifetime of accumulation, sitting in a climate-controlled box instead of scattered on the curb. Even in my rage, I couldn't bring myself to that level of cruelty. I placed the letter next to their coffee maker, where they'd be sure to see it first thing in the morning. The house was empty now except for the echoes of laughter that used to fill these rooms, back when I was welcome in them. That night, I danced in my living room for the first time since Robert died. I put on our old record, Ella Fitzgerald singing, At Last, and moved slowly around the furniture, remembering what it felt like to exist for my own pleasure instead of someone else's convenience. For years, I'd measured love by what I gave, time, money, energy, pieces of myself until there was barely anything left. Now I was learning to measure it by what I kept, by the boundaries I maintained, by the respect I demanded. The equation was so simple I couldn't believe it had taken me 68 years to solve it. The house felt different again, but this time in a good way. It felt like mine. Every corner held memories I'd chosen to keep rather than obligations I'd accepted without question. The Christmas decorations no longer looked desperate. They looked festive, cheerful, appropriate for a woman who was rediscovering joy. I called my travel agent the next morning, a woman who'd booked exactly 0 trips for me in the 5 years since I'd started using her services. Every vacation I'd planned had been canceled. Daniel needed help with the kids. Sarah was going through a rough patch at work. The grandchildren had school events I couldn't miss. "I want to go to Florence," I told her. "As soon as possible." "One way." "One way? Margaret, are you moving to Italy?" "I'm moving toward myself," I said. "Italy just happens to be where that journey is taking me." Robert had always dreamed of Florence. The art, the architecture, the wine, the way sunlight looked different when it hit Renaissance stone. We'd planned to go for our 40th anniversary, had researched hotels and restaurants and museums for months. Then the cancer came, and our dreams got filed away with all the other things we'd get to someday. But someday had arrived, and it looked nothing like I'd expected. I was traveling alone, but not lonely. I was traveling as myself, not as Daniel's mother or the grandchildren's Nana or Robert's widow, but as Margaret, a woman with her own desires and her own money to pursue them. They returned from their cruise on a Wednesday evening. I know this because Daniel started calling at 11:30 that night. his voice escalating from confused to furious across 7 voicemails I didn't answer. By Thursday morning, he was pounding on my front door with the kind of rage I'd seen him display exactly twice in his life, once when he was 6 and I wouldn't let him have ice cream for breakfast, and once when he was 16 and I'd caught him lying about his whereabouts. "How could you?" he demanded when I finally opened the door, still in my robe and slippers, calmly sipping coffee as if my world hadn't just shifted on its axis. "How could you sell our house? Where are my children supposed to sleep? Where are we supposed to live?" The audacity was breathtaking. Not, "I'm sorry," or "I was wrong," or "I should have included you." Just immediate fury that his convenience had been disrupted, that the invisible support system he'd taken for granted had suddenly vanished. "How could you think I was optional?" I replied, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my veins. "How could you look at your family and decide I didn't belong in it?" He accused me of cruelty, of vindictiveness, of destroying his children's sense of security. I accused him of convenience, of treating me like a bank account with a heartbeat, of teaching his children that love was conditional on utility. "You said the cruise was for family," I told him, each word measured and deliberate. "You were right. Now live like it, without my home, my savings, or my silence." The power reversal was stunning. For the first time in our adult relationship, Daniel was the one pleading, the one desperate for reconciliation, the one forced to confront consequences. I felt no satisfaction in his distress, but I felt something more valuable: respect for myself. "Sarah's having panic attacks," he said, as if this information should immediately dissolve my resolve. "The kids don't understand why they can't go home." "Then explain it to them," I said. "Explain that sometimes adults make choices that hurt other people. Explain that actions have consequences. It'll be a valuable lesson." He left without apology, still convinced that I was the problem, that my reaction was disproportionate to his offense. But proportionality was the wrong metric. This wasn't about equal punishment for equal crime. This was about finally standing up after years of being knocked down. Anna met me at the Florence airport with paint-stained fingers and a smile that reminded me why I'd always envied my younger sister's fearlessness. She'd moved to Italy 20 years ago after her divorce, had built a life around art and wine and refusing to apologize for taking up space in the world. "You look terrible," she said, embracing me in the arrivals hall. "It's going to be wonderful." Her apartment overlooked the Arno River, all terracotta tiles and ancient light fixtures and windows that opened like arms welcoming the world inside. She'd turned the spare bedroom into a studio, canvases propped against every available surface, brushes soaking in coffee cans, the whole space alive with creative chaos. "I don't know how to paint," I told her on my second day, standing in front of a blank canvas she'd insisted I'd try. "You don't know how to live for yourself either," she replied, "but you're learning that too." The first stroke was terrifying, permanent, irreversible, visible proof of my inexperience. But the second stroke was easier, and by the 10th, I was thinking less about technique and more about color, about movement, about translating the feeling in my chest into something external and real. I painted my anger first. Harsh reds and blacks that looked like storms or wounds or the inside of betrayal. Then I painted my confusion, muddy browns and grays that swirled without purpose or direction. But gradually, as days turned into weeks, I started painting my liberation, soft blues and yellows and greens that felt like mourning or possibility, or the way hope looks when it's just beginning to trust itself again. "I didn't lose a family," I told Anna one afternoon as we sat on her balcony, watching the light change color as it hit the water. "I reclaimed a self." A letter from Daniel arrived 3 weeks into my stay, forwarded by my neighbor who was collecting my mail. I recognized his handwriting immediately, still the careful script I'd taught him in first grade, still the slightly smudged ink that meant he'd written in a hurry. The letter was angry, confused, full of denial and self-justification. He accused me of overreacting, of punishing his children for his mistakes, of choosing money over family. He demanded that I return immediately, that I help them find a new place to live, that I remember my obligations as a grandmother. I read it twice, then set it aside and painted another canvas, a house dissolving into watercolor mist, becoming part of sky and wind and possibility. I didn't answer the letter. Words had caused enough damage already. Sarah's email arrived 2 months later, shorter and much different in tone. She'd started therapy, she said. She was beginning to understand things about entitlement and assumption and the way they'd treated me. She was sorry, truly, deeply sorry, but she didn't expect forgiveness. She just wanted me to know that my actions had forced them to look at themselves, and they didn't like what they saw. I read her words while sitting in Anna's kitchen, morning light streaming through windows that had witnessed centuries of human drama. For the first time since this all began, I felt something other than anger or hurt. I felt possibility. Not reconciliation. That would take much longer, if it came at all, but the possibility that growth could emerge from destruction. I wrote back one line, I wish you peace. I'm finally living mine. Weeks later, Daniel appeared at Anna's apartment door, looking haggard and uncertain in a way I'd never seen him. He'd flown across an ocean to find me, had probably spent money he couldn't afford on the trip. But he'd come as a son, not as a demanding child, and that made all the difference. We walked to a small cafe near the Ponte Vecchio, sitting at a table overlooking the river where centuries of families had probably worked through their own complicated histories. He looked older, weathered by consequences he'd never had to face before. I never saw you as a person, he said finally, the words coming out like a confession. Just as mom. Just as someone who existed to make my life easier. Then see me now, I replied, and meant it. Not as an ultimatum or a test, but as an invitation. An invitation to know Margaret instead of just mom, to build a relationship based on choice rather than obligation. We didn't hug. We didn't cry. We didn't promise each other anything except honesty going forward. But we sat there for 2 hours, talking like adults who'd decided they wanted to know each other, and that felt like the beginning of something real. I came back to the States 6 months later, but not because anyone asked me to. I came back because I wanted to, because I'd done the work of rediscovering myself and was ready to live that self in the world I knew best. The difference was crucial, choice versus obligation, want versus should. I bought a small apartment downtown, walking distance from shops and restaurants and a life that didn't require a car or depend on anyone else's schedule. It was half the size of my old house, but felt twice as spacious, uncluttered by expectations or resentment or the accumulated weight of other people's needs. Daniel called before I'd even finished unpacking, his voice careful in a way that told me he'd been practicing this conversation. Would you like to come to dinner Sunday? Nothing fancy, just family dinner. The word family had different weight now, stripped of assumption and loaded with intention. I said yes, but on my terms, I'd arrive at 6 and leave by 8:30, and if anyone had a problem with my presence, I'd leave immediately without drama. Their new house was smaller, a rental they could barely afford, but it felt more honest somehow. The decorations were modest, the furniture mismatched, the whole place carrying the slightly frantic energy of people learning to live within their means for the first time in years. Jake and Emma hugged me, not the desperate, guilty hugs of children who'd been told they needed to make nice with grandma, but the simple, genuine affection of kids who were happy to see someone they cared about. Sarah was quiet but warm, her eyes carrying an awareness that hadn't been there before. You can't rebuild what's broken, I told Daniel as we cleared dishes together, the children playing in the backyard, their laughter floating through open windows. But you can build something new. He nodded, understanding finally that this wasn't about returning to how things were. Those relationships were gone, dissolved like houses in watercolor mist. What we were building now had to be different, more honest, more intentional, more respectful of everyone involved. When my son said I wasn't family, I believed him. For the first time in years, I stopped arguing with reality and started accepting it. And that acceptance Painful as it was became the foundation for everything that followed. I stopped begging for a seat at a table that never wanted me there, and in doing so, I discovered I could build my own table, with my own rules, where everyone who sat down did so by choice rather than obligation. The view was different from this new table, broader, more honest, less cluttered with resentment and assumption. The anger that sustained me through those first terrible months has mostly faded now, replaced by something more sustainable, self-respect. I learned that love without boundaries isn't love at all. It's enablement wearing love's mask. I learned that teaching people how to treat you sometimes requires dramatic lessons they'll never forget. I'm not the same woman who stood in that airport terminal, clutching a suitcase handle and waiting for inclusion that would never come. That woman was smaller, quieter, more willing to accept crumbs and call them feasts. This woman, this Margaret, knows her worth and protects it accordingly. My relationship with Daniel and his family is still fragile, still under construction, still requiring careful attention and honest communication. But it's real now in a way it never was before, built on mutual choice rather than assumed obligation. The grandchildren know me differently now, not as the grandmother who gives them everything they want, but as the woman who teaches them that love has boundaries and that boundaries make love stronger. Sometimes people ask if I regret selling their house, if I think my reaction was too extreme. But that question misses the point entirely. I didn't sell a house, I bought my dignity back. I didn't destroy a family, I refused to be destroyed by one. I didn't choose money over relationships, I chose myself over servitude, and that choice saved what was left of my heart. The pain was necessary. The anger was cleansing. The space I created by refusing to be taken for granted filled itself with possibilities I never could have imagined. And that's how I found my place in life again, not by demanding it from others, but by creating it for myself. If this story touched you, if you recognize yourself in the mirror of my experience, know this: it's never too late to stop accepting less than you deserve. It's never too late to remember that you're not just someone's mother, someone's wife, someone's convenience. You're someone. And someone deserves better than being optional in their own life.